I'm going to start thinking I'm special at that kind of attention. That's really good. Thanks. Wow. Well, and you get to see it on YouTube too. I've got it recording. I wish I'd recorded the first class, but that's all right. We'll catch it up. And because I've taught this class quite a few times, and it's one of my favorite classes because it really gets in depth into the history and the culture and the linguistics, the language of the times. But this is what we're talking about, and you can find, I didn't start a new set, but you can find the slide sets on ldalford.com or lionelalford.com in the educator section. So if you want to review these slides and look at them, because as you know, I always have more material than we could ever go through. I don't expect you to absorb it all, but you know, I'll try to make it worth your while, right? That's the point. But in any case, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the Gospels as Greek literature, because they're Greek literature, right? And we're looking at the literary context and the fact that they're the basis for all modern literature. So if you know about, well, one of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was a professor of English and wrote quite extensively about the Gospels as the first examples of modern literature. I'll get into more detail about that in one class when we talk about that. But today specifically we want to talk about the history, because the Gospels as history are very critical. We have a historical context for them. There's also a cultural context that I talked about last week a lot. And recognizing they are the basis, basically the Gospels are the basis for Western civilization. Not just what is in them, but what they propose, what they pre-propose, what is literally within them in the sense of literature, as well as historical consequences of what they report. And we will talk about, that's what we're talking about, the New Testament documents, but specifically the Gospels in terms of literature and history. So, we're up to historical prelude. I got to talk about the history. Why do you got to talk about the history? Why do you got to talk about the culture? Why do you got to talk about the literature, about the Greek? Well, you know, suppose I was to start with talking about the 20th century, about a novel, The Enigma Project, The Enigma. Remember that novel about the codes for Hitler's Germany?
Yeah.
If you had no clue about the history, would you understand the book? Would you understand the focus of the book? If you didn't understand a little German and English, and if the author didn't explain it to you, you wouldn't understand what was going on at all. I can't get in a huge depth about that because German and English are very similar languages, and so for us English speakers, it's not so hard for us to move a little bit into the German sphere. Greek is different. And so the linguistics, the literature, and that's why I've got literature of the Gospels we'll talk about specifically. But if we don't understand the history, we can't understand the Gospels. Period. So let's understand it. First of all, we're talking about the world as they understood the world. And so generally that's the Roman Empire. That makes it easy, because otherwise we'd have to talk about the whole world. We don't have to. It's settled right in the Roman Empire. And we can focus on the Levant. This is the Levant. Levant, when I say the words Levant, this is what I mean. Imagine this end of the Mediterranean Sea, and you can see this area right here, and notice where it is. It's a land bridge between Asia and Africa and Europe. Okay. All my warfare strategists. What would you expect to find in this area? Wars like crazy. Because, look, if you want to go invade Europe, where do you go? If you want to go invade Asia, where do you go? If you want to invade Africa, right? So, and guess what we see? Those who've read the Old Testament, who are Old Testament scholars, you know what I'm talking about. That place was at war all the time. And if you remember the Apocrypha class we had, remember the Maccabees? We'll talk about the Maccabees, because you can't even begin to understand the Gospels until you understand the Maccabean era. So, this is some Greek words of the day. I always like to have Greek words of the day when we talk about Greek literature. This just gets you familiar and familiarized with Greek literature, or with Greek words specifically. But Hellene. Hellene means a Grecian, inhabit of Hellas. Hellas is Greece, and this is, at this time, this is pretty much Hellas, although Hellas extends a little bit further over this way. You notice we have Macedon, Macedonia, right? Macedon. We have, Athens and Sparta. And if you notice all these little places, these are their own little city-states. Because the world is city-states. They're not nations as we understand nations. They're city-states. And what you can control individually as a city-state is what you control. That's true of the whole world. If you notice, we have the Persian Empire, but why are these cities important? These are all colonies of Greece. And
seaports.
Later they become even more important. Yeah, and you notice how the Greeks like seaports, right? Yeah. We're going to find out how they're even more important because in the period we'll see. The period we're talking about, this is an older map, that's all right. I mean older, ancient period. All these areas are really important. I wish I had time to talk about every one of those cities. You recognize some of them. But ecclesia. Now this word is pronounced many different ways. As I've told you before, we have 4 basic ways of pronouncing Greek today. You know, pre-Rasmussian, post-Rasmussian, classical, modern, and there's another one in there too, I think. But in any case, ecclesia, ecclesia. That's classical Greek pronunciation. It is a calling out or an assembly, but it literally means the Athenian democracy. If you remember, I've told you before, every single one of these groups, Thrace, Macedon, Athens, Sparta, each of them had their own governments, each of them had their own assemblies, and each of them named their assemblies with a different name. Some of the assemblies, we know the name of them. The Athenian ecclesia, we know that name. The only thing that in classical Greek that the ecclesia applied to was the Athenian democracy. So you should start thinking. The reason I bring up this word is because this word is a word we generally translate in the New Testament documents as church. Now, riddle me this. Why would the early writers call the assembly of the church an ecclesia? Now, it literally means the called out ones, those who are called. We have ekla and kaleo. So, ekkaleo, called out. But why choose the word for the Athenian democracy? Why not choose synagogue? Because that's a Greek word. The Jews borrowed it. Synagogue means to capture, to collect, like fishes, by the way. The word Jesus uses when he says, I will make you fishers of men, is sune. Fishers of men, referring to the synagogue. It's a pun in Greek. It's a beautiful pun. Because in the synagogue, a synagogue is a led group, where an ecclesia is not led. It has no peer. It has no leader.
What's the name of man?
I don't know. I think it's probably Latin. But that's just the name. It's like, where did the name Syria come from, or Phoenicia? You know, after maybe the people or the group? I'm not sure. And I usually know these things. I have to look that up. Romanos. Romanos. This is a word for Roman. The Greeks used. Romanos. That's easy, right? After Rome. And remember, it's a city-state that has taken over lots of other city-states.
Oh.
So it's not the nation of Rome we're talking about, right? Because you might collectively call yourself a Hellene, right? A Greek in the ancient times? No. What would you call yourself? A Spartan, Athenian, Theban? Yeah, right. Okay, how about this? Let's see. Romanestai. Romanestai means the Latin language. So we find in the New Testament documents, in the Gospels, we find, that they talk about Romanestai, as languages specifically and as people. Barbaros and barbaros. The reason I love this word, barbaros means, our word barbarian comes from it, but it means someone who can't speak Greek. So in the Greek world, if you couldn't speak Greek, you were a barbarian. You could not speak the language of the refined.
Foreigner.
So even better reason for us to know something about it, right?
Girls that are named Barbara.
What was that?
girls that are named Barbara.
There you go. That's pretty good. I wonder where that comes from. Now let's talk a little bit about, remember I told you at the end of the last class I wanted to get into a little bit about the messianic idea, the idea of a Messiah that was coming. The Jewish people had this idea. It basically sprang out of the apocryphal period. That's where we really see it powerfully. And if you remember when we studied the apocryphal documents really pointed to a messianic idea. We don't see it as powerfully in the Old Testament documents. The apocryphal documents really powerfully point to a Messiah, which is interesting because we'll talk about Messiahs. We'll talk about the Messiahs in every generation that the Jews had. But in any case, it comes from the view of the law. The Jewish view of the law is it wasn't devised. God did not invent the law. But the Jewish view of the world is that God's revelation was the covenant to the people at the time in that right time. But it was a revelation of what?
What was?
What already existed. Yeah, exactly. So the view of the Jews was that the law was inherent in the creation. And so it can't be separated from the creation. So therefore, can you separate a Jewish person from the law?
No.
Never. Can't happen. Now, there's another important point because what law covered the Gentiles? The Noahic covenant covers the Gentiles. If you look back in rabbinic literature, as a matter of fact, in Acts, what did they require the Gentiles to do in the first Christian council? Do you remember? Don't eat meat sacrificed to idols, don't commit adultery, right? Mm-hmm. That is considered an abbreviation of the Noahic covenant. The Noahic covenant applies to Gentiles, and the Mosaic covenant applies to the Jews. We'll talk a little bit more about this. But the important thing to note is, so therefore the Jews believe that who was under the Noahic covenant?
Everybody.
Everyone and all the Gentiles specifically, and who was under the Mosaic covenant?
Jews.
So therefore, even in their worldview, and we find that in the Old Testament documents, we find it in the apocryphal documents, and guess where else we find it? In the New Testament documents, that the Gentiles are within the context of the law of creation, which is good for us because all of us are Gentiles, right? This is a very important thing for us to understand because this way we can understand the reason for many of the things that are happening in this period. There's a whole lot of confusion today, especially about laws and laws under the covenants of the children of Israel. Because, as I said, the Gentiles are covered by Noahic law. The Jewish people are covered by Mosaic law. And therefore, according to Messianic Jews today, how do you become yoked to the Mosaic law? You got to become a Jew. So Messianic Jews, for example, practice Mosaic law.
What's co-op?
Children of Israel. That's my notes method, so I have to write it out every time, right? Just like when I write about the Sermon on the High Place, SOHP, Sermon on the Mount, right? Now, the law of God is considered a physical representation of the law that God set into creation. So it's not, as I said, you can't separate it. The laws for individuals are Noahic and Mosaic. And Mosaic, it's really important to note that the Mosaic covenant is all the Torah law, right? The whole Torah. But we usually talk about the Mosaic law, we talk about the Ten Commandments, right? The Ten Commandments are the synopsis of the law. So whenever a Jewish, matter of fact, it does not say in the Hebrew, and I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I've studied some of this pretty well, especially from the rabbinic standpoint. But when Moses brought down the law, the Torah, he didn't bring down the Ten Commandments. He brought down it says literally in the Torah that he brought down all of it. All the words of the law were on whatever he brought down, the tablets. We can discuss why that could be true. Maybe we will as we talk about literature and of course the time. Well, I told you last week. Remember, all ancient literature is mnemonics. They're mnemonics. They're not meant to be read. They're meant to be memorized, and the mnemonics ensure that you are specifically reciting exactly what they say, what you had memorized. In any case, the laws for society, the 10 words, the laws of cleanliness, the 10 words of the Torah,